Call a Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure to order. Pursuant to Committee Rule 6F and House Rule 11.2H4, which I know the members have all memorized, the chair may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting any amendment on which a recorded vote or the yeas or nays are ordered. And without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. So today the committee will consider 4 separate pieces of legislation and 19 GSA resolutions. As a reminder, should the chair hear any advertent background noise, I'll request the member to mute the microphone. And a reminder to insert a document into the record. To members, please have your staff email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. And finally, all bill and amendment texts have been distributed electronically in accordance with the rules. Our first bill for consideration is H.R. 884, the National Aviation Preparedness Plan of 2021. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Aviation is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 884, and I call the bill up for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Will the clerk please designate that amendment?
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 884, offered by Mr. Larson of Washington.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of the substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered base text for purposes of further amendment. So this time I'd like to recognize myself for a statement. So in 2015, I requested a GAO study, Government Accountability Office study, on the preparedness of the U.S. aviation system to handle the spread of a communicable disease during the emergence at the time of the Ebola virus. In other words, this bill was trying to address what at the time was a pre-COVID problem. That study found that the U.S. lacks a comprehensive plan aimed at preventing and containing diseases through air travel, and that such a plan should be developed as soon as possible, and I would like to submit the GAO report for the record without objection. So the report found, in a nutshell, that the FAA and the CDC were not cooperating on preparing an aviation preparedness plan, that both agencies were pointing a finger at each other to take the lead to do such a thing, and the bill that I introduced this year, or actually last year, and the year before that was designed to get the FAA and the CDC on the same page. But again, this was a result of the response to the Ebola crisis, and we found a gap in the response of the FAA and the CDC to handle that. So this is a bill to address future problems in the event of another outbreak of anything. So the aviation industry, the FAA, and Congress have all learned valuable lessons, though, from the COVID-19 pandemic and preceding public health crises, including the urgent need for a plan to help ensure the safety of crew, employee, and passengers, and restore confidence in air travel during which can be uncertain times. So the amendment in nature of a substitute to H.R. 884, a bill I was pleased to introduce, will bring federal agencies, frontline aviation workers, and other key stakeholders to the table to develop a clear, comprehensive plan of action to tackle future outbreaks. Specifically, the ANS requires the Department of Transportation, in collaboration with other relevant federal agencies, to develop a national aviation preparedness plan for communicable disease outbreaks. The ANS also directs DOT to work with U.S. air carriers, airports, labor unions, representing frontline at-risk workers, and key aviation stakeholders to improve coordination between agencies, industries, and nations for screening, testing, quarantining, and contact tracing, to establish a process to identify and provide recommendations on appropriate personal protective equipment for frontline aviation employees, and techniques, strategies, and protective infrastructure for the cleaning, disinfecting, and sanitizing of aircraft, airports, and other enclosed facilities, to identify opportunities to develop and deploy emerging technologies and solutions to reduce disease transmission, and requiring a review of the plan 1 and 5 years after enactment. Finally, the ANS calls for a Government Accountability Office assessment of the plan, including whether it responds to previous public health recommendations, meets the nation's obligations under international conventions and treaties, and to what extent U.S. aviation is prepared to respond to future public health emergencies. H.R. 884 for, and this overall common sense concept is to establish a national aviation preparedness plan was supported by the American Association of Airport Executives, the U.S. Travel Association, the Coalition of Airline Pilots Association, the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, the Airports Council International North America, the Airline Pilots Association, Airlines for America, and the Association of Professional Flight Attendants. I also want to thank colleagues who sponsored this legislation, including Representatives Beyer, Eddie Bernice Johnson, Holmes Norton, and Andre Carson. And again, I want to emphasize we've been trying to get this done for about 7 years, to get this bill passed, and appreciate the committee's indulgence of my comments and ask for the committee's support. With that, I will yield and recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Graves, for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 884, the National Aviation Preparedness Plan Act, it responds to a 2015 government accountability recommendation to ensure that federal agencies involved in air transportation, they have a clear role and responsibilities in the event of another communicable disease outbreak. This bill, which applies to future disease outbreaks, is going to require the Department of Transportation to draft a plan that ensures that the confusion we've seen, and there was a lot of confusion between federal agencies and the aviation industry in the past, we want to make sure that it just doesn't repeat itself. I want to thank you for working with us to make various changes and edits to the amendment in the nature as a substitute. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Graves. I now recognize Garrett Graves, the ranking member of the Aviation Subcommittee, for a statement. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. H.R. 884 directs the Department of Transportation to develop a national aviation preparedness plan that provides the airline industry with an adaptable framework over the next 2 years to prevent and respond to future communicable disease outbreaks. Responding to a 2015 GAO report, there were recommendations that suggested that there be consultation with aviation stakeholders in developing a plan and to periodically review the plan. I think it's important to note that the bill does not apply to the COVID situation and grants no authorities to any federal agency in that regard. Instead, the bill ensures that federal agencies, airports, airlines have a clear understanding about what their existing responsibilities are now and how they should respond if there's a future outbreak. Mr. Chairman, I want to make note, as you and I briefly communicated, I do think that we need to be thoughtful about passengers, GA, charter, things like that, and just think about their role in this overall plan, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are subjected to the different rules. I do want to thank Chairman Larson for working with us on the bill. I know that this has been a policy priority of his, as he's been working on for a long time, and it means a lot to him. I urge members on both sides to support this legislation and yield back.
Thank you, Representative Graves. Are there any other members who wish to be recognized for statements on the underlying ANS? Any members? All right. Thank you. We'll now move to consideration of amendments. The first amendment is Perry 732. Clerk will designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 884 offered by Mr. Perry, number 732.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and I recognize Mr. Perry to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This amendment simply strikes the text of the underlying bill, which would empower the public health agencies to provide further unscientific guidance to burden airports and airlines with regulatory mandates that fail to provide material improvements in health or safety. These are the very same public health agencies that have imposed unnecessary and unscientific burdens on the American people at the behest of special interest groups. Instead, this amendment would insert a broad-based prohibition on the FAA administrators' ability to impose a vaccine or mask mandate on the employees of air carriers, FAA contractors, FAA employees, or passengers. While the courts have correctly rejected the administration's effort to impose vaccine and mask mandates, the damage to the system has already been done, and we need clear congressional action to ensure the administration does not seek to reimpose these restrictions. There are serious staffing issues plaguing the industry and the FAA. We've seen significant disruptions in air travel as a result of staffing shortages and an inability by the agency to move forward on critical congressionally mandated actions as a result of staffing issues. These circumstances are the result of a number of issues, including Congress's and public health agencies' response to the pandemic, as well as the administration's unconstitutional imposition of these mandates. Firing highly qualified aviation professionals and agency employees due to their decision to not receive the COVID jab is a key driver of these issues, and Congress must step in and prevent the FAA from trying to reimpose these restrictions. I thank Representatives Mast and Massey for co-sponsoring this amendment, and I urge its adoption, and I yield the balance.
I thank the gentleman. Is there anyone who wishes to speak on the Perry amendment? Anyone else wish to speak on the Perry amendment? If not, I'll recognize myself. And I would ask members to reject the amendment. First off, to strike the entire bill and replace it with this particular amendment undermines the purpose, the very first purpose of this bill, and that is to force the FAA and the agencies to come up with a national aviation preparedness plan dealing with communicable diseases. Keep in mind, this, the genesis of this bill goes back to 2015, not to 2019. It goes back to response to the Ebola crisis. And we have, in this committee, had very robust debate about mask mandates and such with regards to the COVID crisis. But I think this amendment is fighting the last battle, but the underlying bill is about fighting the future wars. That is, the next pandemic, the next communicable disease that is transmitted through air travel, and address the concerns that we had back in 2015 with the Ebola crisis, and now whatever the subsequent potential diseases will be in the future. So I want folks to keep in mind that the genesis of this bill goes back 7 years, not 3 years, that we need to look to the future based on what's happened in the past by directing the agencies to get along. Again, a second part of this bill, a second reason for this bill is the agencies were pointing fingers at each other, and the GAO found that the agencies, no one agency would take the lead on developing this preparedness plan, and this bill is a forcing function to force them to do that as we look to the future. So I don't want to myself get into rehashing the arguments about mask mandates and so on. We've had robust debates on that in this committee. I really think it's time for us, it may be time in the future to have that debate further, but right now it is time to move forward on telling the agencies to get a preparedness plan done so we can start thinking about the future in the event of the next pandemic or the next disease that we're going to be concerned about coming to the U.S. So I'd ask folks to reject this amendment and to vote for the underlying bill. Thank you, and I'll yield back my time. Do any other members wish to be recognized to speak on this amendment? Right. Hearing none, the question is on the amendment. Are there any amendments to the amendment? I apologize. Are there any amendments to the amendment? Right. If not, the question is on the amendment, on the Perry amendment. All those, now, for those online, be prepared. Unmute yourselves. And all those in favor of the Perry amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No.
We need innovative entrepreneurs in climate.
Or more. You can say more than that if you'd like.
Also stand
The
up
noes,
and
please mute yourself. Please mute yourself, everyone. Thank you. The noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to.
and we
Mr.
need
Speaker, I'd like to request a recorded vote. Weber.
Mr. Weber. Clerk will call a roll then. We're gonna, so we're gonna move immediately to a vote on the amendment. Clerk will call a roll.
Mr. DeFazio. Mr. Graves of Missouri.
about survival.
Ms. Norton.
No.
Just, would the clerk suspend? There's a lot of noise here in the room, and the clerk would benefit everyone by pulling their microphone closer. Yeah, And I tell you what, since we just started, we'll start the roll call over. Can we do that? Have a agreement that we can just start the roll call over? Thank you. Okay, we're going to start the roll call over. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. DeFazio. No. Mr. DeFazio votes no. Mr. Graves of Missouri. Mr. Graves of Missouri votes aye. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Ms. Johnson of Texas.
Johnson of Texas votes no.
Ms. Johnson of Texas votes no. Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Larson of Washington.
Nope.
Mr. Larson of Washington votes no. Mr. Webster of Florida.
Webster, yay.
Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
Napolitano, no.
Ms. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen.
We're voting yes here.
Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Cirrus. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois.
This is a Perry amendment? Unfortunately, I'm going to vote aye. Aye.
Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Katko. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Johnson of Georgia votes no.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Babin.
You say Babin?
Mr. Carson.
Mr. Carson votes no.
Mr. Carson votes
Mr. Carson
no.
votes no.
Mr.
Babin.
Graves of Louisiana.
Babin votes aye.
Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye. Ms. Titus.
No.
Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Maloney of New York.
Maloney votes no.
Mr. Maloney of New York votes no. Mr. Bost.
Aye.
Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Huffman.
Huffman, no.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. Weber of Texas.
Weber votes aye.
Mr. Weber of Texas votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Payne.
Mr. Payne votes no.
Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Mast.
Mr. Mast votes aye.
Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Desaulnier votes no.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Patrick votes no.
Mr. Fitzpatrick votes no. Mr. Lynch.
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Mr. Lynch votes no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon. Mr. Carbajal.
Carbajal votes no.
Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Balderson.
Alderson votes aye.
Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Brown of Maryland.
Mr. Brown of Maryland votes no, 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 no.
Mr. Brown of Maryland votes no. Mr. Stauber.
Mr. Stauber votes yes.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Malinowski.
No.
Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes no.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
Johnson votes no.
Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes no. Mr. Allred. Mr. Van Drew. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
Davids votes no.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Guest. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia is a no.
Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Nels.
Nels votes aye.
Mr. Nels votes aye. Mr. Pappas.
Pappas votes no.
Mr. Pappas votes no. Ms. Mace. Mr. Lamb.
Lamb votes no.
Mr. Lamb votes no. Ms. Maliatakis.
Aye.
Ms. Maliatakis votes aye. Mr. Moulton.
Moulton, no.
Mr. Moulton votes no. Ms. Van Dyne. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Jimenez.
Jimenez votes aye.
Mr. Jimenez votes aye. Ms. Bordeaux?
Bordeaux votes no.
Ms. Bordeaux votes no. Mrs. Steele?
Steele votes aye.
Mrs. Steele votes aye. Mr. Kahale?
Kahale votes no.
Mr. Kahale votes no. Ms. Strickland?
Strickland votes no.
Ms. Strickland votes no. Ms. Williams of Georgia?
Come on now.
Ms. Newman?
Newman votes no.
Ms. Newman votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana?
Carter of Louisiana votes no.
Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes no. Mrs. Sherflis McCormick?
Sherflis McCormick votes no.
Ms. Sherflis McCormick votes no. Mr. Gibbs?
Gibbs votes aye.
Mr. Gibbs votes aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Cohen? Mr.
Cohen votes no.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Sears?
Series votes no.
Mr. Sears votes no. Mr. Katko? Ms. Wilson of Florida?
Miss Wilson of Florida votes no.
Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Gallagher? Ms. Gonzalez?
votes aye.
Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Ms. Gonzalez Colon? Mr. Burchett? Mr. Allred? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Guest? Ms. Mace? Ms. Van Dyne?
Van Dyne votes aye.
Ms. Van Dyne votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss? Ms. Williams of Georgia?
Clerk, well, wait, are there any members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? Hearing none, clerk will report the roll.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 21 yeas and 36 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments? Hearing none, the question is on the amendment nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 And all those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment nature of substitute is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption and favorable reporting of H.R. 884 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed say nay.
No.
Okay, in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. DeFazio?
Aye.
Mr. DeFazio votes aye. Mr. Graves of Missouri? Mr. Graves of Missouri votes aye. Ms. Norton? Mr. Crawford? Mr. Crawford votes aye. Ms. Johnson of Texas? Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes aye. Mr. Larson of Washington?
Aye.
Mr. Larson of Washington votes aye. Mr. Webster of Florida?
Yay.
Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano? Mr. Massey? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Perry? Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Sears?
Series votes yes.
Mr. Series votes aye. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois?
Davis, Illinois, aye.
Mr. Davis of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Garamendi? Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Ketko? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Carson?
Aye, Mr. Carson votes aye.
Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana? Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye. Ms. Titus?
Titus votes aye.
Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Rouser?
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Maloney of New York?
Aye.
Mr. Maloney of New York votes aye. Mr. Bost?
Aye.
Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Huffman?
Aye.
Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. Weber of Texas?
Aye.
Mr. Weber of Texas votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Brownlee votes aye.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Payne.
I was muted.
Mr. Mast.
Mass votes aye.
Mr. Mast votes aye. And Mr. Lowenthal.
Lowenthal votes aye.
Mr. Lowenthal votes aye. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Desailly.
Saunier votes aye.
Mr. Desailly votes aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Patrick votes yes.
Mr. Fitzpatrick votes aye. Mr. Lynch. Ms. Gonzalez.
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Mr. Lynch votes no.
They called me already.
Ms. Gonzalez Cologne.
Aye.
Ms. Gonzalez Cologne votes aye. Mr. Carbajal.
We need you to mute.
Mr. Balderson.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, geez.
Mr. Brown of Maryland.
Mr. Brown of Maryland votes yes.
Mr. Brown of Maryland
All
votes
right.
yes.
Oh, I voted, oh, they want me to
Mr.
vote yes.
Stauber.
Okay, no problem, no problem. All right, I'm,
Clerk will
Carbajal
suspend for a
votes no.
moment. Clerk will suspend for a moment. Members, please, when he calls your name, announce your name and then announce your vote because there's been some confusion and crosstalk. Clerk will continue.
Mr. Stauber. Mr. Malinowski.
Aye.
Mr. Malinowski votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Stanton.
Stanton votes aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Mr. Allred. Mr. Van Drew. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
Davids votes yes.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Guest.
Guest votes no.
Mr. Guest votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes aye.
Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Nels.
Nels votes aye.
Mr. Nels votes aye. Mr. Pappas.
Pappas votes aye.
Mr. Pappas votes aye. Ms. Mace. Mr. Lamb.
Lamb votes yes.
Mr. Lamb votes aye. Ms. Maliatakis.
Maliatakis aye.
Ms. Maliatakis votes aye. Mr. Moulton.
Moulton aye.
Mr. Moulton votes aye. Ms. Van Dyne.
Van Dyne votes aye.
Ms. Van Dyne votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Jimenez.
Jimenez votes aye.
Mr. Jimenez votes aye. Ms. Bordeaux. Mrs. Steele.
Steele votes aye.
Mrs. Steele votes aye. Mr. Kahele.
Haley votes aye.
Mr. Kahele votes aye. Ms. Strickland.
Strickland votes aye.
Ms. Strickland votes aye. Ms. Williams of Georgia. Ms. Newman.
Aye.
Ms. Newman votes aye. Mr. Carter of Louisiana.
Carter, Louisiana votes aye.
Mr. Carter, Louisiana votes aye. Mrs. Sherfilis McCormick.
Sherfilis McCormick votes aye.
Mrs. Sherfilis McCormick votes aye. Ms. Norton.
Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Ms. Johnson of Texas.
Johnson of Texas votes aye.
Mrs. Johnson of Texas votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
Napolitano aye.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Katko. Ms. Wilson of Florida.
Miss Wilson of Florida votes aye.
Ms. Wilson of Florida votes aye. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Payne.
Mr. Payne votes aye.
Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Gallagher.
Gallagher votes aye.
Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Carbajal.
Carbajal votes aye.
Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Staub.
Alderson votes aye. Alderson votes aye.
Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Stauber.
Oh, I already voted.
Mr. Burchett.
Mr. Stauber votes aye.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Allred. Mr. Van Drew, Ms. Mace, Ms. Bordeaux,
Bordeaux votes aye.
Ms. Bordeaux votes aye. Ms. Williams of Georgia,
I understand council says that we need to clarify Mr. Lynch's vote because it was distorted.
That's, thank you, Mr. Chairman. How have I been recorded?
Mr. Lynch was recorded as having voted no.
Yeah, that was a mistake. I'd like to vote yes, please. Thank you.
Mr. Lynch votes aye.
Okay.
How was Stauber recorded?
Stauber.
Mr. Stauber voted aye.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Johnson of Georgia, how am I recorded?
Mr. Johnson of Georgia was not recorded.
I vote aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of Tennessee, how am I recorded? Mr. Cohen.
Mr. Cohen was not recorded.
Mr. Cohen votes aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, Congressman Series, how am I recorded?
Mr. Series is recorded as voting aye.
Thank you.
Are there other members who have questions about their vote? Are there other members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? Hearing none, the clerk will report the roll.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 58 yeas and 2 nays.
Okay. The amendment is agreed to. And the bill, don't we reported to the House here somewhere? Nope, is amended, is approved, and ordered, reported favorably to the House. Next item for consideration is H.R. 2187, Truck Parking Safety Act. Without objection, Subcommittee on Highways and Transit discharge for further consideration of 2187. I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at 8 point. Mr. Bost has an amendment in the nature of substitute. The clerk will designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2187 offered by Mr. Bost, number 044.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read and shall be considered base text for the purposes of further amendment. I now recognize Mr. Bost for a statement on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is in nature of a substitute, makes minor changes to my bipartisan bill, the Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act, in order to finally address the growing need for additional truck parking. Since at least 2002, the United States Department of Transportation has identified the growing shortage of truck parking spaces as an issue of national concern that jeopardizes the safety of truck drivers and the motoring public. My bill addresses this by creating a dedicated funding stream for the next 4 years to allow our federal highway system to increase the capacity of available truck parking spots. The program created in the bill, this bill will help protect truckers like Jason Riverberg, whose life was tragically cut short when he was killed after being forced to park in an unsafe condition due to the lack of available parking locations. However, this bill also increases the safety for the rest of the motoring public as well. Often truck drivers have been unable to find safe places to park their vehicles and are forced to use sides of the roads and off-ramps. This leads to accidents when other motorists don't expect the truck to be parked on the side of the road. Leading up to this markup, I worked closely with the majority and minority staff to ensure that this bill properly addresses the problem at hand and remains focused on the actual problem. I want to very clearly emphasize that we all agree this bill its program is focused solely on increasing capacity for new truck parking. Nothing else is the focus of this bill, and the focus is on where the funding will be spent. As we move forward with this bill, it is my hope that we can quickly pass this bill in the House, and then that the Senate then will take this bill up and put it on the President's desk as quickly as possible. The longer we allow the problem to go on, the worse it's going to get for the trucking industry. The same industry that we spoke so glowingly about throughout the pandemic. The industry that couldn't work from home during the pandemic and is now trying to keep shelves stocked during a supply chain crisis. Let's offer them some assistance during this time. I would like to close by thanking the Representative Craig, who has spent a great deal of time on this issue, partnering with me and supporting it. I also would like to
thank the chairman for bringing this bill up to be addressed on this issue. And finally, I would also like to thank the ranking member and his staff for working so hard to address the lack of truck parking. I urge my colleagues to support the ANS, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman for his statement. I recognize myself to speak in favor of the legislation. I strongly support H.R. 2187 as amended. I want to thank the gentleman for his enduring advocacy during the last legislation we passed, the INVEST Act. And in this, as members will remember, we did provide $1 billion for truck parking in the INVEST Act, and for some odd reason, the Senate version of the bill, developed without consultation with the House or committees of jurisdiction, leaders of committees of jurisdiction in the Senate, excluded truck parking. Totally inexplicable. So this bill would dedicate $755 million over 4 years for projects to construct additional truck parking capacity, but it's not the extra payment that makes the bill possible. It's what it means for the people delivering goods to our stores and doors. It's one solution to try and make the lives of drivers safer, less stressful, and perhaps allow for more retention. I've read of drivers who are on a long route. They could just make the next truck stop with their hours, duty hours, but the next truck stop is full, or it's the truck stop that doesn't provide on-time information about whether they have spaces available. So they fear to go forward, and they lose 2 hours or so. And there's a lot of lost productivity here. And this will really help improve the efficiency of trucking. The most recent survey by DOT, Jason's Law survey completed in 2020, showed parking shortages in every state. I frequently on I-5, I see them parked. I mean, we have some truck parking in the rest areas, but they're often parked going into there. They're parked in what we call the breakdown lane near the rest area. It's not safe for the truckers. It's not safe for other vehicles on the road. So, this is long overdue. And, I really, really hope that, this will receive favorable attention in the Senate. Who knows? It may be something that goes into the year-end omnibus. I hope we can pass it out of the House unanimously in the not-too-distant future when we come back after the August break. And I strongly support the bill. And now I'd recognize the Ranking Member Graves for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I particularly want to express my thanks for working with us on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. I do support 2187, the Truck Parking Improvement Act, which was introduced by Representative Boss. It's been said many times that if you bought it, a truck driver brought it. More than 70% of the freight tonnage in this country is moved by trucks and American truckers, which is critical to our nation's multimodal and interconnected supply chain. Unfortunately, it has been pointed out, a major challenge affecting truck drivers' ability to keep the supply chain moving is a lack of safe and accessible truck parking. So with that, I would urge support and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman for his brevity and his strong support. Now recognize Representative Davis for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Proud to support the Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act introduced by my friend and colleague from Illinois, my friend Mike Bost, which addresses a major safety issue that has come up again and again in my subcommittee, and that is truck parking. Truck drivers are the backbone of our nation's supply chain. Their time on the road is highly, highly regulated. For every 8 cumulative hours of driving without at least a 30-minute interruption, truck drivers are required to take a 30-minute break. Drivers are also required to take a 10-hour break following the 14th consecutive hour on duty. Unfortunately, many drivers, they have trouble finding places to rest. Indeed, there's approximately 1 truck parking spot available for every 11 drivers. This causes serious inefficiencies in the nation's supply chain. Drivers tend, on average, to spend 56 minutes of their available hours of service of that allotment, they are trying to find a legal and safe space to just park. If a driver can't find a safe and legal spot, they often resort to parking on shoulders or, as we all witness in Illinois, on exit ramps. This is not only unsafe for the driver, but also creates hazards for other road users as well. The ANS being considered today is a bipartisan compromise, incorporating ideas proposed by committee Democrats in their Invest in America Act and by committee Republicans in our Starter Act 2.0. Although new truck parking lots may not make the front page of the local paper, these parking lots are an important investment in our interstate transportation network and necessary if we want to recruit and retain drivers in the trucking profession. This bill will help keep goods like gas, food, and medical supplies in stock in all of our communities. The bill authorizes $755 million in competitive grants over 4 years, which means its authorization will expire at the same time as our other surface transportation programs. It also ensures that drivers won't be charged a fee if they park at locations that are constructed, opened, or improved with the new grant funding. Today's markup is an important step in ensuring that the truck drivers get the help they need to safely move freight across America, and I urge support of this legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief here. I want to thank Representative Craig from Minnesota and Representative Boss as well for this bill. I just want to put my oar in the water on this. Having gone to graduate school in Minnesota and driven halfway across the country between the Pacific Northwest and Minnesota several times, going back and forth, can attest to the fact then along I-90 and 94 about the need for truck parking, even back then, back in the day when I was in graduate school. So this is an important bill for truck safety, for passenger safety, for driver safety, and encourage folks to support it. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Others wish to be heard? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to the clerk will designate the First Amendment, which will be Perry 734.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2187 offered by Mr. Perry, number 734.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment strikes the improvement of air quality as a selection criterion for the projects receiving grant funding under the Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act. This amendment seeks to improve the program by ensuring the money goes to projects that increase the availability or utilization of truck parking, facilitate the efficient movement of freight, and improve highway safety and traffic congestion. Ensuring that the substantial amount of money provided under this bill actually funds projects that improve truck parking will have a meaningful impact on the supply chain crisis, but only if it includes the necessary guardrails to ensure DOT spends the money responsibly on projects that will make improvements. Unfortunately, the criterion of improving air quality has the potential to allow DOT to divert these funds to projects that seek to fund electric truck parking under the guise of some statistical air quality improvement at the expense of the true goal of the program, which is improving access to truck parking. By removing this criterion, this amendment improves the bill and ensures we actually receive the expected return from the substantial investment. I urge support of the amendment, and I yield the balance.
Okay, I thank the gentleman. I recognize myself. I rise in opposition, strikes the consideration of air quality and the selection criteria of truck parking safety grants. This was included in Mr. Boss' base bill, not once, but twice. Going back to 2020, included in the draft before us today, because it was negotiated by the majority, minority, and bipartisan basis. This will not apply to truck charging as defined in law. This applies to the provision of auxiliary power to diesel-powered trucks so that they can plug in while they're resting, run their AC or their heat, charge their phones, and not run their diesel engine all night long, wasting fuel. And, that's, ridiculous that, we should have people wasting fuel when routinely this is provided at truck stops around the country. And I expect it will be, with this new additional parking, they will provide for auxiliary charging. But this amendment, as I interpret it, would prohibit the auxiliary charging. And the truck charging of electric trucks is already not allowed under the existing law. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. Do others wish to be heard? Hearing none. Are there amendments to the amendment? Hearing none. Then we are going to move to the question on the amendment. Those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. Okay. And those who are opposed will signify by saying nay.
Nay.
No.
Okay. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. Nays have it. The amendment's not agreed to. We would now move to the next amendment, which would be the clerk will designate Perry 741.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2187, offered by Mr. Perry, number 741.
Okay, without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment makes clarifications to the underlying bill to ensure it reflects defined terms in law and prohibits funding in the Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act from being used for electric vehicle or electric truck charging. The underlying bill refers to advanced truck stop electrification systems, a term undefined in law. This amendment strikes the word advanced and ensures the term truck stop electrification systems reflects its definition in 23 U.S.C. 101 Bowlegs A34, which says a system that delivers heat, air conditioning, electricity, or communications to a heavy-duty vehicle, unquote. Further, the amendment prohibits the funds in the Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act and only the Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act to be used for electric vehicle or electric truck charging. The underlying bill provides a substantial amount of funding for truck parking, more than I would like, in order to alleviate a significant problem that is contributing to supply chain crisis, and I would add, generally, this problem been created by this committee and Congress. This funding has the ability to make a meaningful difference in improving the efficiency of freight transportation by truck and improve the safety and quality of life for truckers across the country. This amendment simply clarifies that this money is actually used to increase truck parking and is not diverted by the administration to its electrification push. At the same time, it clarifies that projects can be used to allow motor vehicle drivers to access truck stop electrification systems as defined in law, again, to improve conditions for truckers who park in these facilities. It's unfortunate that this amendment is necessary, but it is critical to ensure the significant sums provided under this bill actually go to their stated purposes. I urge adoption, and I yield the balance.
I thank the gentleman. Representative Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the gentleman's amendment. This was always the intent of the bill. This aligns with the bill, and I support the amendment.
I thank the gentleman. Others wish to be heard? Hearing none, I recognize myself. I also support the amendment. The truck stop electrification is already defined a term in 23 U.S.C. 1. Federal Highway Administration knows how to carry out this eligibility as it already exists under other federal aid highway programs. It does not include eligibility for electric truck charging infrastructure. So under the amendment nature and to substitute, it would not be eligible, but if adding these extra words to the law would make the gentleman feel more comfortable and then hopefully voting for this necessary bill, I'd be willing to accept the amendment. Do others wish to be heard? Therefore, I would ask unanimous consent to adopt the amendment as offered. Are there any objections? Hearing none, the amendment is adopted. Are there other amendments to the bill? Hearing none, the question is on the amendment, nature substitute as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment, nature substitute, is agreed to. The question is now on adoption favorable reporting of H.R. 2187 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is approved and reported favorably to the House. Next item for consideration is H.R. 8416, the Disaster Survivors Fairness Act of 2022. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 8416. I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The clerk will designate what? I recognize Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As chair of the Subcommittee on Emergency Management, I support the Disaster Survivors Fairness Act, which will simplify the process for seeking assistance following a major disaster. It will also expand communities' access to hazard mitigation assistance so they can build resiliency for the future, and it will save taxpayer dollars by ensuring FEMA resources are going to those who need it most. Last month, our subcommittee held an informal roundtable with stakeholders to identify post-disaster housing needs when it comes to emergency management. It's no surprise that this committee recognized that climate change and the related weather events are changing the emergency management landscape. Today's disasters cause more damage, they have greater impacts on communities, they are more expensive, and they require more time to recover. These new challenges to recovery make it imperative that FEMA cut red tape within its assistance programs, deliver resources to individuals and communities in need, and ensure we're being good stewards of our taxpayer dollars.
Under the premise of us having any kind of permanent administering power over colonies.
Excuse me, someone's microphone is open. Thank you. Please close your microphone. Okay.
This
The
legislation,
gentlelady will continue.
thank you. This legislation will cut red tape by providing states more flexibility to pursue post-disaster housing solutions that are most accommodating to their severe weather risk. It will deliver valuable resources to those in need by expanding eligibility for mitigation assistance, and it will provide oversight to ensure the majority of assistance is not being awarded to wealthy homeowners while low-income homeowners are denied. Finally, and I believe most importantly, the legislation will save taxpayer dollars by reducing the need for long-term sheltering. You remember all those trailers after Katrina that cost FEMA an average of $300,000 per unit. It's common sense legislation, and I ask my colleagues to support it. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady and now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement. Do you have a statement,
I want to thank the chair of the subcommittee, Ms. Titus, and Representative Graves for their work on this legislation, and the staff on both sides of the aisle for working together. The Disaster Survivor Fairness Act includes reforms to disaster assistance for individuals and families, and a key reform in the bill is establishing a universal application for federal disaster assistance. As I've seen in my district with flooding, more has to be done to ensure that folks have better information and access to resources that they need to get back on their feet. And this bill streamlines the process across federal agencies to help ensure disaster victims can recover faster and navigate the alphabet soup of agencies involved in a disaster recovery. I'd urge support and yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize myself for such time as I may consume. I support H.R. 8416, introduced by Chair Titus, Representative Graves of Louisiana. This legislation will significantly improve disaster assistance programs for individuals and family, which, as particularly the gentleman from Louisiana knows, is an ongoing effort in many, many ways, particularly coordination among agencies, which is still a work in progress. You know, the natural disasters are becoming more frequent, more severe. Read a very interesting article this morning by a climatologist who has determined that because of the warmth and the additional moisture in the upper atmosphere, that actually more of these deluge sort of rainstorms will become more frequent. And then of course there are your normal, well, not normal, but your events of every year: tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, and the potential on the West Coast of severe earthquake, all fire, which is a big problem right now in a number of states, particularly in the Southwest and in California. And it's when these things happen, the survivors turn to the government, especially FEMA, for support after what is perhaps the worst thing that's ever happened to them and their family in their entire lives. So we have to do everything to make sure the government offers a hand of support that is fair, capable, compassionate, and efficient. Let's underline the efficient part. In hearings, meetings, when helping my own constituents recover from the 2020 Labor Day fires, I've heard too many stories of bureaucratic red tape, inequitable administration of assistance programs, compounding their suffering, confusion among the various programs that are available, requests for repayment that weren't warranted, and other sorts of things that happen. This package includes several key provisions to improve disaster assistance program survivors' outcome. It will create, finally, a universal application for federal disaster assistance, just one bureaucratic form. Right now, it's many people just give up with the multiplicity of forms and agencies, SBA, HUD, whatever that they have to apply to in addition to FEMA, and a universal application among all of the responsible agencies is really a key step. Pretty simple, it seems, but not simple for the bureaucracy. These agencies haven't wanted to coordinate. Now they're going to have to coordinate and come up with a single form. Secondly, the legislation gives FEMA new authorities. They expand their ability to make disaster-damaged homes more resilient. It's common sense to encourage mitigation activities in disaster. Anyway, homes that were impacted once by disaster, particularly in flood-prone areas or even in tornado or hurricane zones, are likely to be impacted again, and it's best to rebuild or repair them in a way that will provide even more resilience and less damage in the future, less cost to the federal programs, and better survivability for the family and their goods. Third, several amendments are made to the Stafford Act, which will enable FEMA to support innovative post-disaster housing solutions. It authorizes the agency to provide direct repair assistance to homeowners, which may reduce the amount of time survivors must spend in temporary shelters or housing before returning home. Again, a problem where I lost one entire town, Blue River, Oregon, and because their whole community had sprung up over many years in a rural area, they were adjacent to the McKenzie River, a critical watershed. Many of their sewage facilities or septics were, to put it mildly, not adequate. And so it has been a long process to be able to get some approval working with the feds and the Oregon legislature to help to provide a low-pressure system for that community, still a work in progress, so that they can properly rebuild. So some people are still in temporary housing. They can't rebuild on their current parcel. We need to take into account extraordinary circumstances like that. Last, it includes a series of reports and studies that may identify inequities in the administration of current post-disaster housing programs, propose possible solutions. I strongly support it. Ask my colleagues to do the same. It'll help survivors get back on their feet after disasters in a much more efficient, compassionate, and equitable way. And I recognize Mr. Webster, ranking member of the subcommittee, for his statement. Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Chair. The Disaster Survivors Fairness Act makes various changes to FEMA's individual and household assistance program. I'm no stranger in my state to disasters, and I support the bill. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman for being succinct, but he said it all. Are there others who wish to be heard? Okay, Mr. Graves, Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first of all, I want to thank Ms. Titus for working with us on this legislation. You have to put yourself in the mindset of a disaster victim. This is a person that may have had their entire home underwater, destroyed, as we've seen through multiple hurricanes, as we've seen through forest fires, as we've seen through tornadoes and other instances. And then we have the federal government come in and re-victimize these people, whether it's coming in and asking them to fill out applications for SBA, for USDA, through FEMA, through HUD, and other agencies, or it is asking them for the same information over and over and over again without actually giving them answers. Mr. Chairman, we can't continue to have the federal government re-victimizing these people that have been through these traumatic incidences. I'll never forget that in the aftermath of a 1,000-year flood we had a few years ago, or 6 years ago in Louisiana, we were on the phone with disaster victims all the time, and they'd say, hey, we need your help with FEMA or whatever else. And we tell them, yeah, if you go to our website and click on this link and print out this form. And the number of times people turned around and started yelling at me, telling me that their house was under 8 feet of water and they'd love to go to their computer and their printer and everything else, but everything is destroyed. We then worked with Congressman Joe Kennedy, effectively reforming the Privacy Act in 1974 to allow for people to do it right here, like the rest of the world has done. So we've made some incremental progress. I also want to remind the committee, in 2018, we did the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, I always forget that, whatever, DARA. And we made significant progress and reforms, but this bill takes it a step further. I want to say, unfortunately, there are 2 sections in this bill that are effectively fixing what we did in DARA because the agencies have botched the interpretation, one of which we dealt with a few weeks ago, the second of which has to do with emergency sheltering for emergency response personnel. In this case, we have sheriff's deputies, emergency preparedness folks that in some cases don't have a place to stay themselves. I've seen them myself sleeping on the floor in Emergency Operations Center, sleeping on tables and other places. And in many cases, these people have simply left the disaster areas with their families, leaving law enforcement and other critical services unable to deliver their missions. Mr. Chairman, most importantly, what this does is it simplifies the process. You get a single application, you get more flexibility and more efficiency that's going to save the government money in housing solutions. It extends the pilot program for state-led housing initiatives that we had done in the DARA bill. This is a good step in the right direction. It is entirely based upon experience from disaster states, from disasters across the United States. I urge support of this important legislation for us to continue focusing on this area because I think we've got more progress, more reforms we can make moving forward. But again, I want to thank Ms. Titus for working with us on this great bill and urge adoption and yield back.
Okay. Are there other members who wish to be recognized? Hearing none, I just want to recognize again the authors, Chair Titus and Garrett Graves, for this. It's very long overdue. It's quite simple. And now we will move on to consideration amendments. I have a manager's amendment at the desk. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Manager's amendment to H.R. 8416, offered by Mr. DeFazio.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. I recognize myself. I rise in strong support of the manager's amendment. Amendment incorporates FEMA's technical feedback on the final draft of this bill, clarify the intent of certain provisions that addresses the urgent issue of delivering critical aid to disaster survivors. Therefore, it is important we work with FEMA as we improve their processes and address their technical concerns and avoid creating any new and unnecessary red tape. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. If the committee would allow, I just want to take a personal point of privilege at this point in time. It's a rare occurrence when my wife comes to Washington, D.C. She's dealt with my 36 years of frequent absence. There are a few members here who have traveled with her. She's sitting in the rear of the room. Bernie Dowd. We can clap. Thanks, Bert. Okay, back to the bill. The vote on are there others who wish to be heard on the manager's amendment? Hearing none, the question is on the adoption of the manager's amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Hearing none, the manager's amendment is adopted. Now we will move to the first amendment to the base bill, and that will be Mr. Rouser. The clerk will designate.
Amendment to H.R. 8416, offered by Mr. Rouser, number 064.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and Mr. Rouser is recognized to speak in favor of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment really is the result of a lot of experience, not as much experience as my friend Garrett Graves and perhaps some others have had in dealing with disasters. But during my time in Congress in North Carolina, we had Hurricane Matthew hit. We had Hurricane Florence hit in 2018. Matthew was in 2016. Both were very, very damaging to the district, significant amount of flooding. And I remember very clearly, working really hard with the Senate and other members of the House to get the money that we needed through the CDBG disaster recovery program, getting that appropriated. You send out a press release letting your constituents know that help is on the way, only to find out in both cases, in Matthew and Florence, only to find out money doesn't get allocated until years later. 2 years later, 3 years later, 4 years later, up to 6 years later. It's appalling. Appalling. So you start calling and you ask questions. The feds say, well, the state hadn't gotten us the right information yet. And the state says, no, that's not the case. We did that. Federal government, the feds, they're the problem. So you got both pointing blame, to each other. And the truth of the matter is not that either was lying to me. It's the process. It's a very flawed system. A very flawed system. So to address this problem, I introduced a bill some time ago, and I'm offering it as an amendment today. It's the Natural Disaster Recovery Program Act, which would create a new section under the Stafford Act that authorizes a simple block grant program for disaster assistance to states impacted by federally declared disasters. So this is how it would work. It's very simple. In fact, so simple it may be confusing to folks. Put everything you know out of your mind as it relates to CDBG DR. Forget about it. FEMA would calculate unmet need, serve as a pass-through for the grant funds, and reclaim any misspent or fraudulently used funds. No fuss, there's no bureaucratic quagmire with this, and there's no unnecessary delays that re-victimize disaster survivors. The new grant program would allow states to address their unmet needs, could be used for disaster relief, resiliency, long-term recovery, restoration of infrastructure and housing, mitigation, economic revitalization, such as the state sees fit. The program would not make funds contingent on a grantee's submission of an action plan. Instead, states would be awarded half of the total grant funds immediately, allowing recovery dollars to start flowing as quickly as possible. So after a state expends the first half of their grant allocation, they'd be required to submit a report to the authorizing and appropriation committees detailing how those funds would spent, but not only that, they'd be required to have an audit conducted by their state auditor saying that that is so. Now, in the critical months after a devastating natural disaster, I think we can all agree the needs of survivors should be the priority, the sole priority. The more efficiently these needs are met, the more quickly communities can fully recover. They shouldn't have to worry about satisfying a bureaucrat that they can't find somewhere buried in the federal government. Now, to sum this up, there's several things I think that are important to point out. Number one, this puts Congress back in control rather than a bureaucracy. Number two, it keeps disaster relief authorization under the jurisdiction of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. This bill was drafted so that it would go here and go here only, rather than financial services or other places where a lot of folks that think they know what they're talking about, but they really don't. No disrespect to any of my friends over there. And then the simplicity of this allows for better accountability. No more will the state be pointing to the feds and the feds pointing to the state, and disaster victims suffer the consequences. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd submit to my good friend from Oregon that the union would be a far better place with adoption of my amendment.
I thank the gentleman. Others wish to be heard. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, one, I want to thank Mr. Rouser for offering this bill and offering this amendment. Look, this committee has jurisdiction over preparedness for disasters, preventing disasters, whether it's through FEMA, through the Corps of Engineers, making resiliency investments. And what we've seen over the past several years is we've seen the fact that HUD comes in under this Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, and they somehow are responsible for recovery. So here we have agencies like FEMA, agencies like SBA that are doing disaster preparedness, doing disaster response, but then recovery goes to an entirely different agency that has no disaster experience. The amount of money that I've watched being just completely wasted is mind-boggling. Where FEMA would come in and pay for a house to be temporarily repaired, only to have HUD come in 2 weeks later and pay for it to be permanently repaired, where the temporary repairs would be ripped out and then the permanent repairs come in 2 weeks later. In fact, in one incident, I saw it myself, this same week. You can't have this disjointed approach. It either happens to where they're tripping over each other and we're paying for the same thing multiple times, or it happens to where there's a huge gap and you have people, as we do, and I know in North Carolina, where Mr. Rouser represents, the same thing. You have people living in gutted homes with hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank for recovery, and you can't connect the dots. It is unbelievable how inefficient, how much money is wasted, and how we treat our own citizens. We had a disaster in 2016. I mentioned this a few weeks ago. $1.7 billion provided for long-term recovery. Here we are 6 years later, and of $1.7 billion, less than $700 million has actually been given to flood victims for recovery. This is unbelievable. Mr. Rouser's exactly right, and I'll tell you something. This is a result of him representing people that have been through disasters, talking to them, seeing the frustration in their face, and looking at himself and realizing how stupid and disjointed this existing process is. Mr. Chairman, I can't emphasize enough. You may have problems with this amendment. This committee cannot continue this process of ceding this jurisdiction where we're not looking at disaster preparedness, disaster response, and disaster recovery. And that's what Mr. Rouser's bill does. It ensures that we have that entire process, because that's what ensures government efficiency. That's what ensures that these people are being treated right, the taxpayers' funds are being spent efficiently. And I strongly urge adoption of this amendment, support for this amendment. It's going to result in saving taxpayer funds. It's going to result in treating people fairly as American citizens, and it's going to ensure that these different agencies are synchronized in their efforts and not tripping over each other and spending money on the same thing multiple times over. So again, I urge adoption. Yield back.
I thank gentlemen. Others wish to be heard. I recognize myself such time as I may consume. At this point, I would have concerns about the amendment, although I certainly support the intent, and I believe we can work those concerns out, and I believe we can do it in one of two ways. One would be that we could, after we get through some additional feedback and technical assistance on this, we could amend it to the Graves legislation, which we passed in June, or we could move it separately to the floor as a suspension after we make some just additional changes. But I certainly support the intent and would be happy to work with the gentleman and get this worked out before we go to the floor in September with one or both.
Well, I think the chairman, and with that understanding, I withdraw my amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. I thank the gentleman. Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. I move to Garrett Graves 240. Clerk will designate.
Amendment to H.R. 8416, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana, number 240.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment does something very simple. What it does is it triples the civil penalties for identity theft related to disaster assistance. We've seen increasingly, as we've seen in the Paycheck Protection Program and other federal assistance programs, including the unemployment assistance associated with COVID. We've seen increasingly where sophisticated hackers and in fact, folks from other countries are coming in and stealing not thousands, but billions of dollars in U.S. taxpayer funds. As we do things to help improve access to these programs, we've got to ensure that the dollars are going to the right people and not being siphoned off by criminals. So this triples the civil penalties. To be honest with you, I would love to just put them in jail and leave them there. We have seen in our home state where people's identity was stolen and a criminal got assistance and the actual victim got nothing. And so this helps to disincentivize those types of activities. I'll say it again, Mr. Chairman, I'd rather just throw these people in jail and leave them there and love to work with you to just do that. Instead, this is incredible what these criminals are doing to real victims. And so I urge adoption amendment, yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Do others wish to be heard? At this point, again, I would reluctantly oppose the amendment, but we need to be certain that it totally comports with current law. It is already a federal crime, and it'll take a little bit more work to be certain.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, if you'll agree to work with us on this, again, putting people in jail and civil penalties, whatever it is, I'll withdraw this amendment.
Okay, I work with the gentleman. I share his anger and disgust with people who take advantage of disaster situations, and we should teach them a very, very strong lesson with jail time and massive penalties. So I'd be happy to work with the gentleman.
Ask unanimous consent to withdraw Graves 240.
I thank the gentleman. Without objection, unanimous consent, the amendment is withdrawn. We would now move to. Okay, Mr. Perry has a number of amendments, and I understand perhaps he might unblock some of them.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I ask unanimous consent to unblock 736, 733, and 735.
Okay. All right. The clerk will designate the amendment.
En bloc amendment to H.R. 8416, offered by Mr. Perry, number 736, number 733, and number 735.
Without objection, the amendments are considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to speak in favor of the en bloc amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a series of amendments. 736 is the motivation behind it is bringing in emergency personnel from outside the region can put a strain on the budgets of states and localities, especially when response to disaster drags on. While certainly members of Congress can play a key role in disaster response, especially through aiding constituents through disaster-related casework, they should have the means and ability to get a hotel room while carrying out their duties or stay in the same shelters that their afflicted constituents and bosses are dealing with. My amendment just ensures that FEMA's reimbursement created by this section doesn't go to those kind of accommodations that are specific to those members. 733, the amendment adds a GAO report to the part of the bill that waives information collection requirements under subpart 1 of Chapter 35, Title 44. The information's already being collected. The report would just outline the benefits and potential risks associated with the authorizing of said waiver, including how a waiver would affect the paperwork burden for individual small businesses and state and local governments. We want to make it as easy as possible for them, and that's what that amendment would do. And finally, 735 just clarifies the list of ranked reasons for denials required under Section 10, which should include the number of applicants for each individual reason of denial. I certainly appreciate that Mr. Graves included this provision. It allows us to view, broken down by disaster, the reasons why applications for disaster relief are denied, and we need to know that. It will be proactive action by FEMA and could help better inform our response for future disasters. I encourage acceptance and adoption of the en bloc, and I yield the balance of the time.
I thank the gentleman. Do others wish to be heard? Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank Mr. Perry. I think the amendments are well thought out, especially the GAO report, making sure that we emphasize the privacy and make sure that we're not doing anything that will allow the private information, personal information to be released publicly. I also just want to relish in the fact, Mr. Chairman, I think all of us sit here and think about the fact that Mr. Perry's actually come up with 3 good amendments to one bill. I think this is the first markup in history. I think we should all just think about that for just a minute. Urge adoption of the amendment. Go back.
I thank the gentleman. I think this is the second time second hearing it, or markup in a row. So, okay, all right. So, are there other members who wish to be heard? Hearing none, I rise in support of these 3 amendments, or the en bloc amendment. I believe that these measures will improve accountability and efficiency, and urge that my colleagues support them. With that, are there amendments to the en bloc amendment? Hearing none, we'll be voting on the en bloc amendment as designated. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, those opposed say nay.
Aye.
Okay, in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. We would now move to, did we already do that one? Okay. We would move to Perry 740. Clerk will designate the amendment.
An amendment to H.R. 8416 offered by Mr. Perry, number 740.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Mr. Perry is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your support on the en bloc, and it's my understanding I seek to withdraw this amendment with the proviso and the understanding that we will work to craft an amendment prior to going to the floor, which will define the terms of the bill that are in question, and that I will be a part of that discussion. And with that understanding, I request unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
I thank the gentleman and be happy to work with the gentleman on this. And without objection, the UC is agreed to. The amendment is withdrawn at this time. We would now move to I apologize for going out of order there. Just flipping pages. Now the clerk will designate Garrett Graves 241.
Amendment to H.R. 8416 offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana, number 241.
Okay, without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, we talked about the identity theft, the fraud, and making sure criminals are held accountable. This is sort of an alternative to number 240 that I recently withdrew. What this would do is it would have the Government Accountability Office do an evaluation of current practices to help protect identity theft victims, to help prevent identity theft victims from becoming victims in the future, improvements to the FEMA system to ensure that criminals cannot get in, hack the systems, and steal the identity of a victim for the purpose of trying to be rewarded in the aftermath of a disaster. Again, this is just a study to identify better practices for FEMA to prevent identity theft, to prevent the loss of taxpayer dollars to fraud. I urge adoption of the amendment. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Others wish to be heard. Hearing none, recognize myself such times I may consume. I rise in strong support of the amendment, directing the GAO to assess identity theft and disaster fraud and disaster assistance so that we can look for equitable, fair, and strong ways to prevent this. It has happened where people come to apply for disaster assistance and someone has preempted their identity, collected the money, and then it's a very long process for that person to get that straightened out and get the assistance that was misallocated due to either bureaucracy or lack of protections regarding identity theft. And this is something I think that could be dealt with rather easily. And the GAO report will inform the Congress on how best to change the law or what other steps are necessary administratively to take care of this problem. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. Are there others who wish to be heard on the amendment? Are there amendments to the amendment? Hearing none, the question is on the amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. And now the question is on the adoption favorable reporting of H.R. 8416 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is approved and reported favorably to the House. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 7636, the Bright Act, without objection, Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management, discharge from further consideration, H.R. 7636. I call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, first reading, the bill is dispensed with. The bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Okay. Oh, she's not. Okay. I would recognize myself such time as I may consume. I support H.R. 7636, which encourages the General Services Administration to move the most up-to-date, efficient lighting for all routine maintenance, alterations, and construction, gives GSA the flexibility to choose the most efficient operation for each installation. Additionally, the bill asks GSA provide guidance to federal agencies, state, local, tribal, on how life cycle cost effective and energy efficient lighting systems can be utilized to further broaden energy objectives, save money for the taxpayers, both on the consumption bills and on the replacement repair costs in the future. While the Energy Independent Security Act of 2007 did include guidelines for energy efficient light bulb utilization, GSA's facilities managers were not incentivized to maximize cost efficiency with procurement, utilize superior technological advances in a timely manner by directing GSA to acquire and use the most life cycle cost energy efficient. It may be some slightly additional higher cost. I give an example. We built a new courthouse in Eugene, and they had installed in 2000, it opened in 2006, one form of lighting in the garage area. And then they decided, given the electrical bills, that they wanted to upgrade and install a more modern, more efficient lighting in the garage area. And that was an unnecessary expense, which should have been anticipated at the outset during the construction of the building. So this will provide lasting guidance that will maximize resource conservation, responsible use of taxpayer dollars in all GSA lighting procurement. I support Chair Titus's efforts to help the GSA conserve resources and save money for the taxpayers, again, on consumption and replacement. And I urge my colleagues to do the same. I now, I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 7636, it ensures the GSA is using the most cost-effective and energy-efficient lighting in federal buildings across GSA's portfolio. The goal is to save taxpayers money and lower the federal government's energy bill. I support the bill and yield back.
And thank gentlemen. I now recognize Subcommittee Chair Titus for a statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your support and your eloquent description of this bill. I just want to add that this bill had bipartisan support in the Senate, and I think it's safe to say that this bill is a bright idea. It's going to make our public buildings more energy efficient, and it's going to ensure that taxpayer dollars are being spent as judiciously as possible. Simply put, the Bright Act directs the GSA to procure the most life cycle, cost-effective, and energy-efficient lighting in public buildings as practical. Recognizing that each installation is unique and technology is ever-changing, this bill doesn't endorse nor prohibit any particular technology, but rather it guides the GSA to find, pursue, and acquire the most efficient option that would save millions when fully implemented. For example, simply replacing compact fluorescent downlight lamps and linear fluorescent lamps with LEDs, excuse me, could save taxpayers up to $15.6 million a year. Such guidance will ensure GSA pursues and uses the most up-to-date, efficient lighting for all routine maintenance, alterations, and construction to the extent practical. Finally, and I think this is important, the bill will benefit by improving this not only at the federal level, but by directing GSA to provide guidance to state, local, and tribal stakeholders so they can make decisions that make their buildings more cost-effective and more energy efficient. It's really common sense legislation, promotes taxpayer savings. It's good for all levels of government. I thank you for your support, and I urge all our colleagues to vote in favor, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do other members wish to be recognized? Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank Chair Titus for introducing this bill. It's a great idea. Lowering money for the citizens and what they're paying, and lowering our utility bills, a great idea. In fact, I know it's a bright idea, but it's also a brilliant idea. So I urge my colleagues to support this and yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Thank him again for his brevity. Yes, it is brilliant. The LEDs do come in a daylight mode, which in the long, depressing, damp, gray winters in Oregon, I find very helpful, and it has saved me. I mean, the compact LEDs I was replacing all the time. The compact fluorescents. These I installed a number of years ago, and I haven't replaced a single one. So this just makes common sense. Are there amendments to the bill? Hearing none. The question is now on adoption. Favorable reporting of H.R. 7636, the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying nay. Okay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported.
Correction, Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote. Sorry
Okay.
about that.
Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. DeFazio.
Aye.
Mr. DeFazio votes aye. Mr. Graves of Missouri. Ms. Norton.
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Ms. Johnson of Texas. Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Larson of Washington. Mr. Larson of Washington votes aye. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
Napolitano, aye.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Sears.
Series votes yes.
Mr. Sears votes aye. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Katko. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Carson.
Mr. Carson votes aye.
Mr. Carson votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Ms. Titus.
Titus votes aye.
Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Rouser.
No.
Mr. Rouser votes no. Mr. Maloney of New York.
Maloney votes aye.
Mr. Maloney of New York votes aye. Mr. Bost. Mr. Huffman.
Huffman, aye.
Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. Weber of Texas. Ms. Brownlee. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Payne. Mr. Mast. Mr. Lowenthal.
Mast votes aye.
Mr. Mast.
Lowenthal votes aye.
Mr. Lowenthal votes aye. Mr. Mast.
Mr. Mast votes aye.
Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Desailly.
Gallagher votes aye.
Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Desailly.
Sonnier votes aye.
Mr. Desailly votes aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Fitzpatrick votes yes.
Mr. Fitzpatrick votes aye. Mr. Lynch.
Mr. Lynch votes yes.
Mr. Lynch votes aye. Ms. Gonzalez Colon. Mr. Carbajal.
Carbajal votes aye.
Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Balderson.
Balderson votes aye.
Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Brown of Maryland.
Mr. Brown of Maryland votes yes.
Mr. Brown of Maryland votes aye. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Burchett.
Aye.
Mr. Malinowski votes aye. Mr. Burchett.
Okay,
Mr. Stanton.
I'll wait a few minutes.
Stanton votes aye.
The clerk will suspend. Someone has their microphone on. Please turn it off until it's your time to vote. Thank you. The clerk will continue.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Mr. Allred.
Aye.
Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Van Drew.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye.
Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Miss Davids of Kansas.
Davids votes yes.
Miss Davids of Kansas votes aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes aye.
Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Nels.
Nels votes aye.
Mr. Nels votes aye. Mr. Pappas.
Pappas votes aye.
Mr. Pappas votes aye. Miss Mace. Mr. Lamb.
Lamb votes yes.
Mr. Lamb votes aye. Miss Maliatakis.
Maliatakis, aye.
Miss Maliatakis votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Miss Van Dyne.
Van Dyne votes nay.
Miss Van Dyne votes no. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Jimenez.
Jimenez votes aye.
Mr. Jimenez votes aye. Miss Bordeaux.
Bordeaux votes aye.
Miss Bordeaux votes aye. Mrs. Steele.
Steele votes aye.
Mrs. Steele votes aye. Mr. Kahale.
Haley votes aye.
Mr. Kahale votes aye. Miss Strickland.
Strickland votes aye.
Miss Strickland votes aye. Miss Williams of Georgia. Miss Newman.
Newman votes aye.
Miss Newman votes aye. Mr. Carter of Louisiana.
Can you and Ryan get coordinated?
Mrs. Sherfilis McCormick.
Sherfilis McCormick votes aye.
Mrs. Sherfilis McCormick votes aye. Mr. Graves of Missouri. Mr. Crawford.
Crawford, yes.
Mr. Crawford votes aye. Miss Johnson of Texas.
Johnson of Texas votes aye.
Miss Johnson of Texas votes aye. Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Katko. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Bost.
Mr. Bost votes aye.
Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Weber of Texas.
Weber votes no.
Mr. Weber of Texas votes no. Miss Brownlee.
Miss Brownlee votes aye.
Miss Brownlee votes aye. Miss Wilson of Florida. Mr. Westerman, Mr. Payne,
Mr. Payne votes aye.
Mr. Payne votes aye. Ms. Gonzalez Colon, Mr. Burchett, Ms. Mace, Mr. Moulton, Mr. Auchincloss, Ms. Williams of Georgia, Mr. Carter of Louisiana.
Are there members who are not recorded, wish to be recorded? I'm not certain that the clerk caught Ms. Brownlee's vote. Did you? It was kind of distorted.
Ms. Brownlee is recorded as having voted aye.
Okay. Okay. Where? Mr. Carter? Where? Okay. Can you unmute? Can't hear you. No, can you unmute? Raising your hand doesn't quite, but he's got like, okay, he's like exclaiming that he can't get unmuted. Okay. Yeah. Let the tech try for a second. And if that doesn't work, okay, Mr. Garamendi, well, is Mr. Gardner recorded?
Mr. Garamendi is not recorded.
Okay. Okay.
Mr. Garamendi votes aye.
All right. Did we get Mr. Carter fixed? Wait, he has staff assistants there.
Can you hear me now?
Yay! Yes.
Mr. Carter, Louisiana votes aye. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Louisiana votes aye.
All right. Anybody else having technical problems, otherwise laggard, who wish to be recorded? Hearing none, the clerk will report the roll.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 49 yeas and 4 nays.
Okay. Then the amendment is, or the bill is adopted. And the other question, the ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Now we move on to the last item of business. We will consider 19 General Services Administration Capital Investment and Leasing Program resolutions. I ask unanimous consent to call up all the resolutions en bloc so that they can be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so order. Recognize myself for a statement. I support the 19 GSA resolutions for us today. 17, authorize GSA to repair, modernize, replace roofs, elevators, fire protection, plumbing, electrical, heating, air conditioning, waterproofing systems in GSA-owned buildings, California, South Carolina, Colorado, District of Columbia, Washington State, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Montana, Georgia, Oklahoma, Vermont, and Ohio. 1, authorizes GSA to lease space for the Department of the Army's Stryker Brigade combat team in Sumner, Washington. And 1 resolution authorizes GSA to exercise a purchase option for a building located in Washington, D.C. that is currently used by the Federal Regulatory Commission to save funds over the longer term. I support these resolutions, urge my colleagues to do the same. I now recognize Ranking Member Webster for a statement.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I want to thank the chair and the subcommittee chair for working with us. I support all 19 of these and ask my colleagues to do the same. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Other members wish to be recognized? Hearing none. Are there amendments to the GSA resolutions? Hearing none. The question is now on adoption of the 19 GSA resolutions en bloc. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
And those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. 19 resolutions are approved. I ask unanimous consent that each bill ordered reported today will be reported as a single amendment, nature substitute, incorporating amendments adopted without objection. So ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical clarifying conforming changes to each of the bills ordered reported today, reflect the actions of the committee without objection. So ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 22, Clause 1, I ask unanimous consent that chair as designee be authorized to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the legislation adopted today or similar measures. Without objection. So ordered. I ask unanimous consent that chair after consultation with the ranking member, has authority to strike, revise any provision the bill's order reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee, or that would cause bills or concurrent resolutions to violate the Budget Act or the stupid pay-go point of order. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, members have at least 2 calendar days in which to file a supplemental minority additional dissenting views on legislation adopted today pursuant to Rule 6 of the Rules Committee on Transportation Infrastructure. Notes the President of Quorum for action taken on all committee business today. With that, the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure has completed its business. The committee is adjourned.